You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back to the Virtue Podcast. I'm Robert Jackson, director of the Great Hearts Institute. And this podcast is an opportunity for us to spend some time with those who are extending the great conversation in our day. People committed to classical liberal arts education for everyone. Like today's guest, Dr. Carol Reynolds, longtime professor of music at Southern Methodist University, now serving as a professor with Smithsonian Tours. And I consider her not only unforgettable, I would love to use the word prima donna, but I know that has the wrong connotation, Carol, so I'm not going to use it exactly, but it has to do with the first among equals. I mean, you are incredibly valuable to the work we're doing here in classical education. You are I can't find the right word, Carol. What's the right adjective to describe Professor Carol? She's a one of a kind, without question. Welcome, Carol.
Well, thank you. Boy, that's pretty. Could we have that on tape and I'll just play it some days, when I'm sitting there trying to clean my cabinets or wonder, where the whatever. That was a very kind of thing for you to say. And of course, I've spent my life in music, so I know really what prima donnas are, especially the ones that have earned that title. Thank you. Right. So I'm at their feet as well. But thank you. It's glorious to be with you always.
Well, Carol, I'm so pleased that in your time as a professor, you've obviously developed the expertise necessary to speak to the work that we're doing in K-12 education. So now that you've been working for more than a decade with classical educators, both homeschoolers and schools, I'd like for you to reflect a bit on what you have seen in these United States, in this country, in terms of teaching music. What has the general trajectory of music ed and music appreciation been like in this country? What have you seen, just so that our audience understands what we are working with today?
Well, that's such an important question. And spending my adult life, most of it, virtually all of it, in the teaching of music history, other aspects, what we call general history as well, at a large part of it at SMU in Dallas, in a phenomenal school of music called the Meadows School of the Arts, where you had just top-notch everybody. I had something of a skewed view. I mean, I knew very well that this was a rarefied atmosphere, but when you're working along in a glorious craft sailing down the Grand River, you look off to the side and go, boy, I'm glad I'm where I am. I'm glad I have this that I have. But stepping out of that, it's pretty grim. That's a fact. I mean, my generation was pretty much one of the last ones where, first of all, almost any teacher could play an instrument, especially in the secondary school, especially elementary, where you had a strong emphasis on choirs and bands. And some of that has survived, especially in states like Texas and parts of the country where, the band is really glorious, or where choirs and orchestras flourish and have good budgets. But overall, you look across the United States, it is not a happy picture in many places. Plus, you don't have a parental sense of how important the arts are. That's a whole nother topic. Then you have the logistical issues that and all of which was just made 10 times worse in many cases by the shutdown we all have just gone through. So that decimated so many arts programs, we don't even go down talking about that. Plus, the thing about, so all of that, it's not grim, but it's that next step up. Now, it can be pretty grim. And I could tell stories just as anyone about meeting people all the time, young people, young parents, eager to do the right things with their children. And you find out very quickly and it's understandable, they have zero background or 0.2 in the arts, for example. Not to mention literature, not to mention the great conversation, the classics, the orientation towards history and these are people that, where would they have gotten it? Think about that. Where were they going to go to get this? They didn't have you. They didn't have great arts. They didn't have all these classical educators and these classical academies. So it can be pretty distressing. On the other hand, there you are, you see.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And you can't give what you don't have. I hear what you're saying. And so for those families and those parents who have a sense, I've got to do better, I've got to give my children more than what I might have received. How has your work begun to address these deficits, right? These are folks that they would want more for their children. But in as much as music performance and music history and the arts generally, as you say, have been in decline, how have you gone about beginning to address those deficits in our culture and in the classroom?
Well, when we began, I didn't think of myself as addressing deficits. I thought of myself as putting together materials in a standard tradition. The tradition has been handed down to all of us.
Hmm.
I got it from professors who had been, in many cases, people who had fled Europe in World War II, or at least their teachers had. I mean, my theory teacher had studied with Arnold Schoenberg, for example.
Hmm.
One generation away from the great generations, two generations away from the late Romantic, masterful people about whom books will never stop being written,
Right.
right?
Right.
So the tradition is there, and you know this from what you do with everything you do. It's not like we have to reinvent the wheel. Fire, water, these are already there. The question is, how do you reconnect to them? And I still think the best way is absolutely the traditional way. I believe very much in old-fashioned pedagogy.
Hmm.
It's been working for thousands of years. I don't see any reason to toss it out. And so our first course, Discovering Music, was exactly what you would expect I used to call it a freshman level back when that was more intense. Okay.
Hmm.
Music, what people say, music appreciation, there's nothing wrong with that word, but people think that means something frilly, and it's not. But at any rate, I took a little bit of the meanness out of it that you might have encountered, 30 years ago in a good freshman course. And add a little more white space to the text and realize that people were starting at a much less well-informed position for
Hmm.
especially our middle schoolers, our high schoolers. And then from that, we started building courses. I found myself creating courses in American arts, history, and culture because my field is things Russian and secondarily things
Hmm.
German, East European as well. But I found myself teaching more and more at SMU in American music, courses in American music history, courses in the American musical, and also in the field of sacred music because of my interest in Russian. Then you get into orthodoxy. The next thing you know, you're doing graduate seminars on Orthodox church music, which I never saw coming, but that's how it goes, right? So we began extending out and trying to address needs. When people said, we wish we had something on early sacred music, boom, well, why not? And then opportunities, you mentioned Smithsonian, but when I began with them in 2011, I suddenly found myself places with my husband, Hank, who's amazing, as you know, and fascinated by all the technology that suddenly allowed people like us, people like you, to make high quality video, which would not have been true 20 years earlier.
Hmm.
You didn't
Hmm.
needed a
Hmm.
crew, you didn't needed budgets. Now you needed a little bit of equipment you put in a suitcase and off you go. So there we found ourselves very actively filming for courses. We traveled around the United States for one of our American history courses called Exploring America's Musical Heritage. Filmed as any place they'd have us, we were there. You can't believe the places we knocked on doors. You know what they say, it's easier to ask forgiveness than to ask permission. And so I won't even say more than that because I keep thinking one day I'm going to get a knock on the door, like, you did what in our internet? But then, it began expanding about the time I discovered the people in this group. People like Martin Cawthron and Chris Perrin and Andrew Curran, meeting you, I should say, the serendipitous, providential breakfast where you and I met through a mutual friend, a wonderful
right.
classical educator who
Yep.
introduced it. And bingo, next thing I knew, I was at your conference. And
Indeed.
bingo, was that ever inspiring? Because I think that's what happens. I hope everyone who's out there, you make the step, you say, I want to do this. Oh my goodness. And then things start happening. And the
They
next
do
thing
indeed.
you're in the journey.
Indeed. Yeah. It was certainly an auspicious meeting there in Dallas. And then, of course, to bring you out here to Phoenix for our second symposium. You've been with us ever since. The fact that your work as Professor Carroll, aka Professor Carroll, as we have right there
Yeah.
on your nameplate, has really brought so many homeschooling parents and now school teachers to a more full awareness of how music is more than a soundtrack. It's certainly more than the sort of background or muzak, right, that we listen to piped out over the PA. It really is something for the full life that we're trying to grant the next generation, that to know the music, to love the music, to understand its relationship to the larger culture. That's the project you've undertaken. You mentioned several of these courses. I want to be clear to the audience. You can go online to professorcarroll.com and you can see the coursework that Carroll and Hank have put together, because it really is a kind of primer in how to bring oneself into, to really lay hold of the riches of musical culture from the West. And we are so thankful for it. Sorry, Professor, I just had to kind of
that's
throw
all
that
good.
in there
I'm
as a
listening.
blurb.
You know, when someone says so many nice things, I'm thinking, yeah, that does sound interesting. And I go, oh, he's talking about my things. But, you know, I have to say this. I was also blessed by the participation, and you know, because you know some of our courses from the inside, of colleagues, friends, former students. I joke, all those people who instead of getting a C minus got a C plus, and now they're conducting major orchestras all over the world, right? But it's kind of if you've been in programs where you had to keep your scholarships. Actually, I had so many brilliant students, but then I was actually writing about a student. I won't even say this person's name, a brilliant artist, top in the vocal field. And I was thinking about her today, telling somebody about her who ended up as a medalist in the Tchaikovsky competition in Covent Garden. And, you know, and of course, students don't like music history when they're young, right? In fact, often young people don't like history at all. They don't know what it is. I mean, how can you know when you're 9 or 14? And I was remembering this extraordinary artist and how she had to grapple with the need to come up with a perfect final, and what she did to make sure she had a more, you know, with extra credit. And 2 years later, she's in Moscow, you know, as the top of the Tchaikovsky competition. She would have been anyway, you know, of course. And that's a silly thing maybe to tell about. But each student, and this is something all your teachers know, you know, each student has this potential. They aren't all going to go off and conduct major orchestras. They aren't all going to go off and head up the something music teachers to say. But, you know, the fact is they're going to love the art. They're going to take their kids to museums because they learned how to go to museums and not be intimidated and not be bored. And believe me, there's techniques. And that's something we've done a lot in recent years, Rob, about and I have to say, this is something I really love now. I do a lot of talks saying strategies for introducing art history, strategies for experiencing a museum, strategies for concerts, because people used to be taken by the hand as children.
Right.
And so they grew up, it was just as natural as going to the park or on a hike or to a picnic. And so it can be so intimidating to parents, and they think they have to get something from it that's very specific. And that's not really where you start. Just as you don't start your first visit to a wildlife trail with your child with a list this long of which leaf they should find. You're going to go find the weirdest leaf you can find, right?
That's right.
So, look, sweetie, look at this red and green and blue leaf. Isn't that pretty? And that's really where you start with the arts with little ones. So recently, we've been creating a lot of materials for a younger audience.
Well, let's talk about a few of those, right? Because I think that's important. I'm pretty confident that our listener viewers are going to come from among the teachers in classical education, certainly some of those homeschoolers that you've reached, some school leaders, but families are behind all of this because, as we like to say in classical education, they are the first educators. Our work in the schoolhouse is to support them, right? Is to continue the good work that they've begun. But if they're nervous, they're a little scared or skittish about doing these things related to music, what are some basic strategies that you are going to recommend to them to get their children initiated into the wonderful culture of music that is ours?
Well, the first thing is the most natural thing. And I don't think, I think generations previously knew this, but then it got lost with so many other things. And that is to sing to your children. And if you say, I don't have a good voice, come see me. We'll sit down, we'll have some tea, and I'll explain to you the basic fact that unless you can really produce no sound whatsoever out of your mouth, and that's possible, okay? If you can speak, you can sing. You may not like how it sounds, but your child does not know that you do not have a beautiful voice. And maybe when they're 9, they'll tell you, but right now, for a child, the most important voices are the voices of mama and Papa gets in there pretty soon, and everybody else. The voice, the speaking and singing voice, sing when they haven't yet come into this, taking that first breath. But the singing of children to children is how you put that's the whole groundwork. That's the foundation of any musical tradition. So every lullaby, every little silly song, you cannot overdo singing to your children. And even when they're older and they say, Mom, don't sing us that lullaby. They love that you sing them the lullaby. And they'll say they don't, but they do. And
it's true.
Wait for room and you sing it in the hall. I mean, it doesn't
It's true. Our 10 and 13-year-olds will often, grimace when mom or dad begins to chime in with a tune. But somewhere beneath that grimace is a little smile. You can tell because they still keep coming around. They don't run to their room and shut the door.
No.
They give us a little lip, and that's fun. That's fun.
Well, that's the gift of love and sound is what
It
it
is.
is.
It
You
is.
know, and from that you're training the ears. All these little songs. I say to parents, let them sing "The Wheels on the Bus" 7,000 times if they must, because what they're
Mhm.
learning with all of these songs is the tonic dominant relationship, the major minor scale system.
Mm.
They're learning so much about phrases and balance and form. All of these classic children's songs. And we have a songbook we put together when we call it our COVID project, because when suddenly we were all shut in, we wanted to make a songbook, since people have songbooks in the attic, but if they're like mine, they're all crumbling. They were your grandfather's, your great grandfather's,
Right.
and you pick them up and they're on the floor in little crumbles. So Hank and I he did all that incredibly fastidious, I would have lost my mind work of putting all rearranging them and all that little notation program.
Sure.
No way. So, but anyway, but then we had fun. We called it Hurrah and Hallelujah, which my granddaughter named, as I've said many times. I think it's kind of a good title, because that's what songs are. They're Hurrah and Hallelujah. And it's got everything from Who Put the Overalls in Mrs. Murphy's Chowder to favorite hymns to patriotic songs, riddle songs, game songs, rounds, and the very tradition. It's only 100, but boy, I tell you what, there's a whole lot of kids out there that don't have 4 traditional songs in their repertoire.
Right. No, that's true.
And you can hear, because of technology, I mean, I'm always double-edged sword, but you can hear 25 different voices sing these classic songs, from Renee Fleming and people at the Metropolitan to Burl Ives, or somebody just out on a back porch somewhere in West Virginia that, has a banjo.
And that's right. Yep. And all you got to do is just pull them up right on YouTube or Amazon Music and go at it and hear again 100 different voices with these true modern classics. So I appreciate that songbook. It's sitting right there on our upright piano, and I force the kids to sit with me at least once a week, so
you do that
a couple of rounds. Well, now, that's a great way to get started, just to make sure that parents are singing. What are a couple more? Just give us a couple more strategies for how to make this just an integral, seamless part of life in our families.
Well, then, of course, you got it, as with anything else, at some point you want to teach kids not just to eat the stuff you put on their high chair, table, or what do you want to call that? But, they have to learn something about why something is something. And then they have to ultimately learn that you don't heap that much mashed potatoes on your plate. And then, then you want them actually to learn how to peel a potato. And I mean, it is a process. It's very much like everything else we do to nurture. And we nurture people with nutrition all the time, or with physical health, or with picking up your room. It's not that different. Parents don't feel confident about it. But the main thing is exposure, not just to recorded music. If at all possible, you want to be live music. And people say, and this is one of the things I try to stress too, you do not need to take your family of 7 and spend a huge amount of money. And I just say the Houston Symphony in the back row, where you have a kind of situation where your tickets are $100 each, or you spend $75 each. And there you are trying to have this symphony experience. And you look back, and 14 minutes later, they're halfway asleep, and then they are asleep, and then you're asleep. And then you say, never again. And I mean, so we do a lot of things in some of our webinars. I do a lot of monthly and weekly webinars. A lot of them are available to the public on things with younger kids, as I say, strategies, families, whatever. So we'd love to have people getting on our email list at professorcarol.com, and then you'll see all these go by. But the fact is, your kids, let's say they're 4th graders, they're going to be just as impressed by the high school orchestra or the middle school orchestra. When you're 9, the 14-year-olds sound really good. You may be doing this. Actually, they pretty much these days sound really good, because the standards of band, choir, and orchestra in the secondary schools have lifted so high. I mean, you can't believe what the best high school orchestras play. What would have baffled an orchestra in 1920? Things like, Rite of Spring. I mean, even, So the point being, you don't have to spend a bunch of money to go. And I don't recommend you spend that bunch of money. Go to the local musicals, go to the local, of course, craft shows and glass blowing demonstrations and chamber record. If there's a college anywhere near, they'll be thrilled if you show up sometimes. Go to church where there's a good organist and a good organ, don't let them, yes, it can be a lot of money later. Do that later. Or not even at all. Let them pay for it later when they're grown. But you lay the foundation by exposure to music, and you can get the highest level through all these streaming things that are out there. Don't spend them. I mean, yes, if you can afford the tickets, if you can subscribe to your symphony, your local this is great, but that can't be an obstacle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. In fact, I think that too often parents are allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good, because there are so many good ways, right, that we can just
Mhm.
bring music back into our lives in ways that are accessible and not going to bust the budget. So I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that you've been doing, and you've commented to me on a couple of occasions of how your time with Smithsonian Journeys as a professor of record, taking tours right up and down the Rhine and in various places in Europe, has given you an opportunity to take a look at and have conversations with the generation of grandparents
Oh,
who
yes.
themselves have begun to express real concern and interest in what they can do for their grandchildren. So maybe you could even include here just a little
Yeah.
caveat, strategy or otherwise, as to how to get the whole family involved. What could a
Yeah.
grandparent do to really infuse or otherwise promote music and music education for their grandchildren?
Well, the whole grandparent thing is an underutilized resource, I think, in our classical education movement and education renewal. It used to be that grandparents, and you go back to when I was a kid, you had your mom in the schools volunteering and cooking in the kitchen. That doesn't happen now, I don't think, too many places. And grandparents came, and, Grandparent Day is not going to make it. I mean, that's lovely, but that's not what happens. You've really got to tap the generation that maybe one of the last ones that got this kind of education in the public schools. Most of our generation didn't have private schools. You didn't need private schools. I look back at my teachers and I am awed at the level that we had and who these people were. I mean, I didn't know exactly. But the point is, there still is a layer of society that got a pretty good basic education. So partly they're shy, partly they're intimidated by the fact that their grandchildren are now in the, don't start me. Don't give them the phones at 6 and the iPads at 7. I mean, let's not even start there, because I'll alienate somebody. I don't care. But they see their grandchildren coming in and they're immediately glued to some kind of a little, I won't even use the language I'd like to use, right?
Yep.
And then they don't know how, they don't think they have, what you do. I mean, okay, you take the thing and you stick it in I don't know, just put it in the chicken barn if you've got a chicken barn. But that's one of the first obstacles. They feel like they can't interrupt this kid's modern way of doing. Oh, yes, you can. You're the only one maybe who can. See, grandparents, if they're involved with the kids and allowed to be involved with the kids, they have the authority parents often don't. They're not timid. One of the things everyone always said, you get a certain point in life, you're not timid anymore. And I thought, well, that's nice. And then now I know what they mean. Oh, you're not. Maybe you make a bunch of mistakes anyway, but so what, right? So
Sure.
And you, as a grandparent, have oral tradition. Tell your stories. And if you're not good at telling your stories, get your sister or your sister-in-law or somebody, the cousin that heard these from another relative. Tell your stories. Pull out your stuff. Sing these songs with the kids. But it is just the most ripe and important basket of perspective information. Nobody will get it if you don't do what you have to do. And that is an urgency, which you realize as you get older. Does that help any? I don't know.
It does. And I think one of the things that you have really helped me to focus my attention on, and of course to share with the grandparents of our children's grandparents, is how important they are, how valuable they can be in promoting the good work that we're doing in the school and the good work we're trying to do at home, so they can actually work with us. So yes, they do have some authority. They can kind of begin to disrupt perhaps some of the usual distractions, right, of the age, and say we're going to do some things that are hands-on. That you're going to hear a story, you're going to hear a song, you're going to go with me to that local performance, and we're going to witness this for ourselves together, right? This is going to be a shared experience, and I think a lot of that is in decline.
But I was going to say, you can pick up something with it too. You play board games, get out a name this tune thing.
That's right.
Watch, if you're going to watch something, watch classic music. Watch the musicals. The musicals are critical.
That's exactly where I wanted to go. You did, of course, study Russian music. You traveled and went to Russia to complete your graduate studies. But I know a few of those Russians who immigrated had a significant influence on American popular education in the past century, in the 20th century. And as you mentioned at the outset, you have a great deal of interest in what we might call musicals and the music of a popular genre, right? Like Broadway. I'd like you to
Absolutely.
I'd like you to kind of give us a few hints here as we round this conversation out as to where we can see the up and comers and where we might be able to actually re-engage a generation who's lost touch with performed music through something very popular like the musical. So maybe
Right.
just give us a few thoughts on where you see some shining or bright spots, right, in the
Okay.
musical pantheon.
Well, musicals are operas. They're American
Mm.
initially, but not completely because the Viennese had the same tradition. They are spoken dialogue opera rather than sung throughout. You have spoken dialogue and then the songs and choruses, right? And the instrumental sections. Whereas traditionally opera, people think about it as being sung throughout, but there are many types of operas and different national slants. And some nations prefer spoken dialogue. So Germans preferred it. English speakers preferred it for a long period of their tradition. So that's a whole different thing. We deal with that in our courses, and you can learn to see why the languages lend themselves more to singing or speaking or whatever. But the musicals, going all the way back to the things that, the Showboat, and even back to the reviews and the Great American Songbook. This is the nuts and bolts, the meat and potatoes, or the veggies and the fruit juice, whatever you want to call it. This is really, and if you lay a tradition where your children know, I don't know, Music Man and Sound of Music, and as they get older, I mean, King and I, and whatever, they learn that. They learn this generation of musicals. Showboat, as I mean, some of these are very, very serious topics too. Some of them you need to make sure, but that's how you teach these things. Fiddler on the Roof teaches so much history. I don't even know where to start. You could do a graduate seminar off of Fiddler on the Roof, from the art as well, everything else. But then, you look at what's been done since, and the decline in many ways of the American musical with a few bright spots, and what happened in the 70s with all that anyway, and Jesus Christ Superstar, that was wild. But what does that reflect? The culture, the culture, the culture. So again, the songbook of the musicals, the Rodgers and Hammerstein, the Irving Berlin, the George Gershwin, there's a nice Russian, Gershwitz, the Gershwitz boys.
That's right.
Is their parents had immigrated, but there they were. Those two boys ran off, and they didn't do what their mom and daddy had hoped. They did very well for themselves. But you do that, and then you look at something that's happened recently with Hamilton, which has grabbed a whole new generation, just like Phantom of the Opera did.
Yep.
And you can debate this and that, and then you've got a nice forum for debating. So if you lay the groundwork with musicals, you're just a hair away from the operatic tradition. And once you're in love with musicals, you're in love with La Boheme, and you're in love with Traviata, and you're in love with the Marriage of Figaro or the Barber of Seville. I mean, there's no curtain between these repertoires other than format.
I love it. So we can bring them along. We just have to be a little more savvy in the way we approach them. Obviously, they've got plenty of things vying for their attention, but if we can show them top shelf stuff and let them listen to it, let them be the discerning, let them be drawn to it, right? Because they love it, because they like it, and they eventually love it, and pretty soon they're going to be swept up, right, in the music that is our tradition.
Yeah, and I know we don't have much time, but what's kind of fun? Something may not work for everybody's kids. Depends on the age. Go get an old or a new gramophone player. Records are back in everywhere.
Yeah, that's right.
You can go into a Goodwill store or a thrift store and for 50 cents pick up all these beautiful albums. With it, and the kids are kind of fascinated by putting the needle down. We've got 3 players here in this house. We pick up all the old recordings, the old children's records where they had the great symphony orchestras and the marvelous like Cyril Richard and all these great Boris Karloff doing kids music. So they may enjoy that, but it's just look for quality.
Quality is where it's at. Professor Carol, you are quality, my friend, and I want everyone to know on this podcast that you're going to be joining us next February, hopefully with Hank.
Yes.
Join us next February in Phoenix, and we're going to be talking about the tradition today. And we're just going to continue this very conversation around where music belongs at the very center and heart of our work of classical education. So thank you for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you in Phoenix next spring. And in the meantime, you keep bringing it with Professor Carol. And we're going to get all of our folks who are listening, in the show notes, we'll put access to professorcarol.com and the whole host of materials that you've got there. You're also teaching a course with Memoria College. We'll also include that in the show notes, and anything else you want to send our way, including the next Smithsonian tour that you're leading. Because if you're at the helm, I highly recommend that they tour the Danube with you and Hank. There's no better way. No better way to do it.
Well, we'll
Thanks
see
so
you.
much.
Thank you. We're looking forward to your amazing conferences. That symposium is something else.
Take care, Carol. Thanks
Bye.
again. Registration for the 2023 National Symposium for Classical Education is now open. Join us February 22nd through the 24th in Phoenix, Arizona for 3 days of unsurpassed scholarship, professional workshops, and networking opportunities. For more information, visit www.greathearts.institute. Working together to renew the tradition.